The first mistake I see all too often is trying to do too many museums. Washington, D.C. has amazing free museums, but too many travelers try to pack way too much into a single trip. Museum fatigue is a real thing. When you go to a museum, you're going to do a lot of walking, which is physically demanding, and a lot of reading, which is mentally taxing. That's not to say museums aren't fun or rewarding, but it makes me sad when someone tells me they went to one of my favorite museums and didn't really enjoy it because they had hit a wall of museum fatigue. I think you need to be strategic when it comes to museums. Pick out the exhibits that you really want to see and focus on those, rather than trying to cram in every single museum just because. And hello, my name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and hacks for exploring Washington, D.C. And over at triphacksdc.com, you'll find info about tours and more. After 4.5 years of posting videos on this YouTube channel, and even more as a tour guide, I've heard about plenty of mistakes that travelers have made. And I rounded them up so that hopefully you can avoid making them. With that said, let's continue. Mistake number 2 is not preparing for the weather. Washington, D.C. has 4 seasons. In the summer, it's extremely hot and humid. In the winter, it's cold, but usually not quite freezing cold. And while spring and fall tend to be somewhere in the middle, we do occasionally get a cold snap or a heat wave. So it's really important to plan for the weather when you're visiting, which means checking the upcoming forecast right before you leave for your trip and making sure you pack the right clothes for the season. If you're coming in the summer, it also means bringing sunscreen and water bottles so that you can stay hydrated, and planning your days so that if you're here when it's going to be really hot or really cold, that you're not outside for long stretches at a time. Mistake number 3 is over-planning the trip. It's good to have a plan. In fact, if you're subscribed to this YouTube channel, it's probably because you're trying to figure out a plan for an upcoming trip. And hey, that's great. The mistake I see is when people over-plan their trip. And what that means is they have a schedule and every single minute of every single day has a planned activity. The reason why this isn't ideal is because it leaves you no flexibility. If you're here and say, really enjoying a museum and want to stay longer, you can't if you already have another commitment that you have to get to. Or what if your plans get disrupted by rain or some other kind of weather? It's hard to reshuffle an itinerary when it's already completely packed. So my advice is plan one must-do activity every day, and then keep a list of things that would be nice to do that you can slot in as you see fit. Mistake number 4 is underestimating travel times. One thing that people frequently misjudge about cities, especially if they live in the suburbs, is how long it takes to travel a relatively short distance. Rush hour traffic in DC can get really bad, and traveling 5 miles from one end of the city to the other in a cab or an Uber can easily take 45 minutes to an hour. Of course, we have Metro and Capital Bike Share and a whole bunch of different ways of getting around. But you have to be realistic about the fact that Metro, even though it is relatively efficient, is still not lightning fast. So give yourself extra time to travel to the places where you need to go. If you have reservations or tickets to something, plan to arrive early rather than at the exact time that the thing starts. That way, if there's a delay or you just misjudge the travel time, you'll still make it. Trust me that it is a billion times better to arrive early for something than it is to arrive late. Mistake number 5 is ignoring things that aren't free. Look, one of the best things about Washington, D.C. is the amazing number of completely free things to do. In my $20 per day challenge series, I spent 3 consecutive days in DC and didn't spend more than $20 each day because I stuck primarily to free activities. But I still think it's a mistake to completely ignore anything that isn't free, because that means you'll be missing out on a lot of amazing tours, live entertainment, or sports. If you can afford it, the best itineraries are often the ones that include a mix of free activities and paid activities. Because the free activities, while great, are mostly museums and big federal government sites. And DC is so much more than just that. Mistake number 6 is not making reservations. Now, during COVID, you needed reservations for just about everything. That's not as much the case now, but there are always going to be some things that you need reservations for. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, for example, has used timed tickets since it opened in 2016. and I suspect will continue to do so in the future. If you want to eat at a Michelin-starred restaurant, you're not going to get in unless you have a reservation. And during the busier times of the year, like spring break and summer break, some things like TripHacks DC tours do sell out. So you'll want to make sure you get your tickets in advance so you don't miss out. And mistake number 7 is not spending enough days in DC. One thing that makes me sad is when someone tells me they're only planning on spending a couple of days in DC and they're struggling to squeeze in everything that they want to do. The reality is, it's not really possible to do everything on a single trip to DC. And this is doubly true if your trip is only a few days long, or worse, only 1 day long. Now, if you live nearby and think you'll be back in the future, a weekend trip is perfectly fine. And whatever you don't do, you can just save for the next one. But if you're traveling a long distance, a huge mistake is to assume that DC isn't a big city and only plan to be here for a day or two, because you'll miss out on a ton of stuff and it won't be easy for you to come back and do it later. So my advice is, plan for a minimum of 3 days if you live nearby and think you might take another trip in the future, and a minimum of 5 days if you live far away and don't think you'll ever be back. But hey, if you made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around. If you want to see even more mistakes, well, give this video a thumbs up and leave me a comment and say you want to see a part 3. And I highly recommend another TripHacks DC video. So go ahead and click or tap right over here to watch the next one. And if you're coming to DC and want to sign up for a TripHacks DC guided tour, you can click or tap on the Capitol Dome on the left side of my head. That'll send you right over to triphacksdc.com, where you can see all of the tours that we offer. Enjoy your trip.